Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I am Santita Jackson. It's a joy to be with you today. Meet my morning stars on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Like and subscribe, if you will, and please click the bell so that we can notify you whenever we come up live with more and more information for you. And please meet me on the Santita Jackson Show, no, the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page, and of course, Santita J at X. We're going to be talking about two really, oh goodness, important topics today: police torture, which is alive and ongoing. I'm not going to say alive and well, but certainly alive and ongoing in the United States today. We've been hearing about the Mississippi Goon Squad, white police officers who sexually tortured and beat, even shot one man in the mouth, for heaven's sake. Going to talk about that case, but we have a case kind of similar to that. Someone who was beaten into a confession by the infamous Commander John Burge's colleagues. We're going to be talking with Fred Hampton's lawyer, attorney G. Flint Taylor, about that. All of these cases are really in a bundle. In the next hour, we will be talking about election 2024. As we course through this season of primaries, one cannot help but notice the underwhelming support for the Democratic ticket. One cannot help but see the lack of enthusiasm, the growing dissent, and on and on and on. Can that be good for the Biden-Harris ticket and going down ticket? Remember, there's much more than the glittering stuff at the top. The people who really impact how you live are those people in local and county and state offices. We just had a primary, 5 primaries yesterday, certainly here in Illinois. We had 24% turnout. So all across the nation, really the minority are controlling the lives and destinies of the minority. Do you want to live that way? Let's talk about it here on the Santita Jackson Show. But in the first hour, let's talk about police torture, everybody. Oftentimes you're told if you comply, you'll be all right. But sadly, oftentimes when you comply, you die. Let's talk about that today. This Mississippi Goon Squad case has riveted everyone just as we come on to air today. One of the officers has been sentenced to 40 years in prison, yet another 18 years, another one 20 years. Why? I mean, and the judge has had very, very sharp words for each one of these officers who were involved in this. Indeed, we've got to talk about this with this panel today. Reverend Dr. S. Todd Yeary, senior pastor of the Douglas Memorial Community Church in Baltimore, one of the iconic churches in all of the United States. And of course, he's from the national leadership team of Rainbow Push, and the chair of the Transformative Justice Coalition, one of the leading voting and civil rights advocates in the nation today, Attorney Darrell Jones, who is also a host with Barbara Arnwine of his own radio show on WOL at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time every Tuesday. We encourage you to listen. They need your support. They give you a lot of great information. But we're going to start with Attorney G. Flint Taylor. He has been and is Fred Hampton's lawyer. He is the person who really turned the police narrative, the initial narrative that this was a shootout between Mark Clark and a Black Panther who was charged with guarding Fred Hampton over through the night. He said these two men engaged in a shootout with the police. It was only because of the diligence of G. Flint Taylor that we found out that that was not true, that all the bullets were shooting into the apartment. And he has doggedly pursued justice for Fred Hampton and for the John Burge cases, Commander John Burge in Chicago, whose office tortured young Black boys and teenagers and young Black men for years with impunity. He was able to go to Florida and live beautifully. And he doggedly pursued him so that he and those who he tortured could get justice. Before we talk about the Mississippi Goon Squad, it's a related case. Jackie Wilson, who served years in prison, falsely imprisoned, because he was beaten into a confession for shooting two police officers. They received a $17 million settlement, and you guessed it, the person who pursued justice for Jackie Wilson, attorney Gene Flint Taylor, joins us today. I encourage you to get his memoir, The Torture Machine, Racism, Police and Police Violence in Chicago. Attorney G. Flint Taylor, how are you today?
Very well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on again, Santita. It's always good to be with you and with your esteemed fellow guests this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, we've been looking at the Mississippi Goon Squad. Um, it seems like there are goon squads everywhere. One of the original goon squads is Commander John Burge. Who was he?
Well, John Burge was a lieutenant of the Chicago police here, and the parallels are very chilling in terms of Mississippi and Chicago. And the torture in Chicago lasted like what's been going on in Mississippi for 2 decades. And it was headed up here in Chicago like it was in Mississippi by a lieutenant down there it was the sheriff's department. Here it was the Chicago Police Department. And they used the same kind of tactics, electric shock. They used tasers up here. They used a shock box, and they also used the cattle prods. So they used mock executions, putting guns in people's mouths and pulling the trigger. They did it down there. Up here, they never actually shot somebody in the mouth, but down there they did. The beatings, the sexual aspect of the torture, and also the racist aspect of the torture, all very similar to what went on here from the 70s to the 90s under John Burge, and even to the name. Up here, they called themselves Burge's Ass Kickers. Down there, they called themselves the Goon Squad. So we have the parallels that are really chilling between the pattern and practice of police torture, which led to Jackie Wilson's torture back in 1982 and 36 years in the penitentiary before he was exonerated. And ultimately, he has gotten a settlement only from the county officials so far, that being the prosecutor's office. The city of Chicago and Mayor Brandon Johnson, to this point, has not come forward with a similar settlement for Burge's role in the torture. We'll see whether that happens or not in the near future, but so far that hasn't happened.
What happened in the Jackie Wilson case?
Well, people in Chicago who have a memory back to that time, it was a very intense time, and 2 white Chicago police officers were shot and killed on the south side of Chicago. The police department, and particularly the units under John Burge, went completely berserk in search of the person who shot the officers. Reverend Jackson, among other people, stood up against this wave of terror that went through the entire Black community of Chicago, looking for 5 days for the perpetrators of the crime. The shooter turned out to be a man by the name of Andrew Wilson, and he was in a car with his brother Jackie. Jackie was driving, and when the police officers stopped them, his brother, unbeknownst to him, hopped out, and when the cops tried to search him, he shot both of the officers. Jackie stood by in shock, but they charged both of them with murder. They tortured both of them mercilessly with electric shock, with suffocation, with mock execution, all the kinds of things that they did also to the young men down in Mississippi. They got confessions, and Andrew got the death sentence, and Jackie got life imprisonment, even though his crime was basically to have been in the wrong place at the wrong time when his brother committed the murders. That's a little bit of a thumbnail of the case. Andrew brought from prison a lawsuit charging Burge with torture, a civil rights lawsuit. No one would represent him, so we ended up representing him. So back in the 80s, we were representing Andrew Wilson in his torture case. And lo and behold, many years later, we ended up representing Jackie in obtaining his exoneration and ultimately the settlement that you mentioned.
When you look at I mean, we have talked about Chicago being known as North Jackson, Mississippi, to so many people, not just because people here migrate from Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, et cetera, but there's something about the oppression that one has to deal with in Mississippi. It continues on northward to Chicago. What is going on, and why is so much of this torture sexual in nature?
I think it goes all the way back to the days of slavery, and I think it goes back to the slave patrols. I think it goes back to white supremacy and law enforcement and aspects of law enforcement enforcing the law. I put quotes around that. By these kinds of means, because of the inhumanity of the officers, because of the white supremacy that they were invoking. And of course, an important part of that had a sexual aspect to it, as well as a tremendously violent aspect to it. And that's, I think, what you see and saw in Mississippi. Of course, you saw it through the entire slavery period and beyond. And that's what you have seen here in Chicago over the many years that Burge was leading this reign of torture in Chicago.
Do you know, it seems that the system came in on Jackie Wilson, and people lied on him. Talk to us about that. And has anyone, if that has happened, has anyone paid for that?
Well, here in Chicago, there's been a battle over many decades to expose the police torture. Lawyers such as myself, community activists, survivors of police torture, families of those who were tortured, have fought an intergenerational and interracial battle covering 30, 40 years to expose this pattern and practice of torture, to get men off of death row and freed as a result of the fact that they were tortured into giving false confessions, and for many of the men who have been exonerated to get bring lawsuits and get the kind of compensation that that Jackie Wilson has just gotten. Also, this struggle has led to the very unique and remarkable reparations that were obtained here in Chicago back in 2015 for some 60 police torture survivors who had no legal remedy. But because of this political movement, it compelled, at that point, Mayor Rahm Emanuel and City Council to grant reparations that not only gave the men a financial compensation, but created a center for the treatment of torture survivors on the south side of Chicago. It also received an apology from the mayor and city council. There's a memorial that's being built to the torture survivors, and perhaps most significantly, there are the torture scandal. The truth of the torture scandal is taught to 8th and 10th graders in the city of Chicago's public schools every year as part of these reparations.
Are you surprised then what happened in 1982 was repeated 40 years later? I
guess I have to say no. I mean, police have sophisticated their methods. Here in Chicago, I don't think they bring out a torture box anymore, but they still know how to coerce confessions, particularly from young people, particularly from juveniles, maybe more psychologically than physically sometimes. But nonetheless, they still do it. There are still wrongful convictions based on tortured confessions in the broader sense of the word. But to see the brutality, the pattern of brutality in Mississippi is still, perhaps it's not the best word to use, but it's still shocking in a way, in the way that it's shocking here in Chicago, because it's not the kind of, quote, run-of-the-mill type of brutality or coercion that police often use across the country. But it is the kind of torture that you kind of identified with South Africa under apartheid, or you identified with South America or Central American regimes where torture was prevalent, where Burge, or Vietnam, where Burge learned his tactics of electric shock and dehumanization. That there it was of Vietnamese people, here it was of Black men and Black people on the south side of Chicago.
We're talking with Attorney G. Flint Taylor, Fred Hampton's champion, his lawyer. He has been fighting for him, his memory, and really for the clearing of his name for nearly 60 years. You've got to get his book, The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. It is a very real thing, and it is a tremendous read. I saw you nodding vigorously in a sense, Reverend Dr. Todd Eury. Why?
Well, first, when listening to Mr. Taylor counsel lay it out, we do see the vestiges of that kind of behavior, albeit more sophisticated, but certainly all the more sinister, particularly around juvenile interrogations, the coercion that is often used to facilitate confessions from minors without the benefit of either having counsel present or adequate notice of parents to be able to protect the interests. There's actually ongoing a tug of war in Maryland right now while our legislature is meeting about juvenile justice reform, where just last session in 2023, the legislature said that you could not interrogate a juvenile without the first having the consultation by the parent with an attorney. Well, because that has impacted the ability of law enforcement to get the kinds of cooperation, in air quotes, and confession from minors, there's an actual struggle going on with revising that law just 1 year in, because it does hamper the patterns and the practices of law enforcement to be able to do what they do. We only have to go back and remember in Chicago when I was still living there. Remember the incident of the young girl who was riding her bicycle, and we had a 6 and a 7-year-old actually charged with her murder, only to find out later after DNA was done that they had nothing to do with it, and it was someone in their 30s. We have to remember that the manipulation and the abuses that we've seen going all the way back to the very beginning, the genesis of what we know to be policing in this country is still going on. We have a former member of Push's own staff who was wrongfully convicted after a teenage confession by the Peoria Police Department, was later exonerated, and is still litigating the resolution and the remedy for the harm that's been done to him in federal court. So much so that the judge who was initially assigned the case, when it was reassigned to that district of the federal court, had to recuse himself because he was an attorney for the city of Peoria at the time. And so when we look at how far these things go and how deep they reach, we have to recognize that we've changed the form. We haven't changed the substance, by which the manipulation goes on. And so when we hear about what has happened from the Goon Squad, and let me say that Goon Squad in Baltimore means something much differently, because it was clergy who were activists who were known as the Goon Squad in Maryland. They are of significant reputation and folklore, one of them being the late pastor emeritus of the church that I now serve. But the Goon Squad, in terms of the horrors that are imposed upon certain persons who are in police custody to effect the kinds of confessions that often lead to convictions, wrongful convictions, and long terms in prison, is still a thing. And because we have to remain vigilant, we have to tell the story that Mr. Taylor knows firsthand, to remind us that simply because it looks different doesn't mean that it is different. It is still the same kind of harm, still same kind of damage, and still the same kind of unchecked power on policing that requires more oversight, not less, even in 2024.
Well, before I go to the very dapper and handsome attorney Daryl Jones, who's wearing his bow tie, looking like he's one of the fruit of Islam today, let me read to you from, hey, that's a great thing, from the New York Times. You look like you are ready to go to court, all of you. This is from the New York Times. The headline reads thusly: Goon Squad officer is sentenced to 20 years in Mississippi torture cases. A federal judge ordered Hunter Elwood, who shot one of his victims in the mouth, to serve 20 years in prison. Jeffrey Middleton, a former lieutenant who supervised the Goon Squad, was sentenced to nearly 18 years. Mr. Elwood broke down in tears as he turned to face Eddie Parker, 36, and Michael Jenkins, 33, and apologized for what he had done to them. And I quote, "I hate that I was involved in this. I hate what's happened to them," close quote. As Mr. Elwood left the podium, Mr. Parker stood up and said he forgave him. Outside the courtroom, Mr. Jenkins, the man Mr. Elwood shot in the face during what was described as a mock execution, said that he did not forgive Mr. Elwood. Quote, open quote, "If he wouldn't have gotten caught, he would still be doing the same thing," close quote, Mr. Jenkins said. 4 other officers will face sentencing this week, one of whom has gotten 40 years. I mean, I'm struck. I know Attorney Taylor can't stay with us very long, but I certainly want you and Attorney Jones to deal with this more fully. But Attorney Taylor, he said, "I don't accept your apology. If you hadn't been caught, you'd still be doing the same thing." And I must tell everyone, there is a New York Times investigation into Rankin County policing, Rankin County in Mississippi. And the things that they have found out are just, they're not shocking, but they are very disturbing. They have used the powers of their offices to spy on their girlfriends. They have acted with impunity. And people in the community have been complaining, they're not there to file charges, but they certainly have spoken up. But no one has acted upon any of these outrages, of these crimes, Attorney Taylor. He said, you'd still be doing this. Apparently, they had a reputation in the community for terrorizing the citizens this way. How does one get away with this, Attorney Taylor?
Well, the powers that be are in bed with the ones that are doing it. I mean, the prosecutors rely on the police and turn their backs on the brutality when it's reported. The judges do the same. When people bring it to court, they're not believed. The pattern builds up to a point. It built up here, not because of what law enforcement or investigators did, but what the community and what we all did to bring all of these cases to light. And at some point, it has a critical mass that even the powers that be cannot ignore. And in Mississippi, it turned out that finally the U.S. government and the U.S. Attorney's Office said, this is just too outrageous at this point. There's too much going on. We can't turn our backs to it anymore. The community outrage is such. And so they finally prosecuted some of these people after what, 20 years? And they finally prosecuted Burge here at a point when they can no longer prosecute him for torture because the statute of limitations has run. And so they prosecuted him for obstruction of justice and perjury. He was put behind bars, and there was vindication that was felt by the men who were tortured by him, who got to sit in the witness stand and look at him and tell their stories and see that they were believed by a jury. But what it took in terms of community outrage, whether it be at Push, whether it be in the streets, all of that was happening, whether it be at the mayor's house where people protested. Those were the kinds of activities, along with compiling such a long history of a pattern and practice of torture here, a pattern and practice of torture there, that finally led to some kind of very delayed modicum of justice. And again, we put quotes around justice because this certainly isn't full, complete justice by any stretch of the imagination. But it's at least it's on the front page of the New York Times, and people say, "Hey, it must be true, right?"
Well, yeah, but for the cases, that's absolutely true. But for the cases that don't make it to even the town paper, what does one do? Because if you speak out, you're afraid of recrimination. I mean, and that's a very real thing. Because even though the New York Times has written about these cases, Attorney Jones and Reverend Dr. Yeary, these people are still living in fear for their lives, as well they ought. Because the police force is quite strong. I can't wait to hear from Attorney Darrell Jones, he and Barbara Arnwine are the reason we know about Ahmaud Arbery. And they saw the corruption it was just everywhere, from the root to the fruit. Just the prosecutor was involved. Go home, wash, clean yourself up, so that we're going to work this out. After you have killed someone, you've blown a hole into somebody's chest. So, I mean, so what does one do? I mean, whom do you report this to, Attorney Taylor? I mean, what do you do when you've been violated by the police?
Well, I certainly would love to hear what Attorney Jones and Reverend Yeary have to say about it. I've kind of been dominating the conversation here, and
well, you hold on, because I would love for you, Attorney Jones. I certainly want you to comment on what you've been hearing, but why don't you share with him what you saw? Because you're the one, you and Barbara Arnwine you're the ones who broke the story nationally. You told us, hey, you need to look down here in Georgia. Something's happening here. And we were all shocked by what we were hearing. Please tell us about the prosecutor, all of that. Just thank goodness somebody got the tape to see how this man was hunted down. Just talk to us.
Well, Santita, it's really great, number one, to share the stage with these two heroes that are on the front lines fighting these battles with us. Now, what happened, though, in the Ahmaud Arbery situation was really wild, because what we had happened there, obviously the story was Ahmaud's 25 out for a jog and went through a white community in Brunswick, Georgia, and there was chased down by three neighborhood white men, if you will, and cornered, trapped, shot, and killed. And with the allegation that he had stopped in a house that was under construction, that was completely open, to take a look at it because he had dreams of being an electrician and building homes. But the interesting part of what happens is that as they try to execute what they are calling a citizen's arrest for no reason on Ahmaud, and they end up killing him, one of the killers, the father, Gregory McMichael, calls his former employer, who happened to be the prosecutor for that county, for Glenn County. And the Glenn County prosecutor then steps in and has the police that have responded to leave the three of them alone, directs them to stand back, do not arrest, don't do anything. They're covered with Ahmaud's blood. The power, the gauge of the shotgun that was used is the type of shotgun that they used to bring down an elephant. And it was done at point blank range. When they hold up Ahmad's shirt at the trial, you can see the entry hole, the burn hole from the rifle. That's how close it was in the T-shirt, as well as the exit from the back of the T-shirt. So that's the degree of the power of what happened to him. And they are covered with his blood. They are sent home, according to the prosecutor. She said, tells the police, don't arrest them, sends them home. Well, subsequent to that, the Arbery family then goes through the steps, and this is just the incredible bravery of that family. They go through the steps of going down to the prosecutor's office, demanding to know what happened in the case. And it wasn't until the father took his brothers with him and transferred their property and their wives' names, because they're saying we're probably not coming back this time, demanding to know what happened, that the tape subsequently gets released. And that's when we learn the story and we see it all of what unfolds. There are a bunch of lies that are told to the family from the prosecutor, that he was caught inside of the house and shot inside of a house. All of these lies that were laid out. But ultimately, what comes out of this is that because of the persistence of the family and the community, another prosecutor is ultimately brought in on the case, and that this case is subsequently brought to trial. We haven't completed the story yet. We have 3 of the shooters that have been convicted. We've been around first, second, and third base with them. The home plate will be when we finally convict the prosecutor because of her actions in trying to cover up and to obstruct the evidence and obstruct the arrest in this case, which is where we are now. She now has been charged, and we're awaiting a trial date there. But that is sort of an understanding, a glimpse of what happens with power that's left, uncalled for, and not being called for, not being brought to the attention. And so that's what we see happening in Glenn County. When I think, Santita, of what we see that happened in Rankin County, Mississippi, number one, the first thing that comes to my mind is how many Rankin County situations are there across this country that we don't know about? We know about the GOON squad now, but what else do we know? We know that in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they had a Brave Cave. Same thing, same type of officers, bringing black folk and brown folk in there, beating them, sexually molesting them, trying to coerce information out of them. And it is not until a couple of African-American attorneys break it that they find out that this is going on, and the county police there have to take responsibility. It's not just there. Baltimore, Reverend Uri, they had the Jump Out Boys. They were doing the same thing. And we all remember Tyree Nichols in Memphis. And there it was the Scorpion Squad. The same concept of policing that we see that's in Mississippi, the same that I believe Attorney Taylor was speaking of with regards to the cases that he's handled in Chicago, is the same mentality that persists today. And that's really problematic. The question is, what do we do when we encounter this type of situation? Well, I generally start by having my clients file internal affairs reports, because we don't want them saying there's no internal affairs report that's been filed, forcing the police officer to try to do something in front of their own internal affairs, getting them on record, making them have their written statements so that we have something that we can pick apart and show the inconsistency and the lies that are there. Beyond that, it becomes a thing of lawyering up and being certain that you have a competent lawyer that has the ability and the wherewithal to be able to bring in, because there's a lot of investigation that's going to be involved and a lot of work that's going to be involved to go against a police department. So, those are some of the starting steps of what goes on. We didn't get to internal affairs with Ahmaud Arbery because, we went straight into the prosecution of the guys. It took the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, I should say that. It wasn't the county that brought the charges. They weren't bringing charges. There were actually 2 prosecutors that declined to bring charges, not just Jackie Johnson, the one that is on trial today, was a neighboring prosecutor that worked for her at one point that also refused to bring charges, exonerated the 3 guys. It ended up being the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, the state body that came in, and within 48 hours, they had the guys charged appropriately for the crimes that they committed.
Well, is the local, is that The fact that they had to go to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation lets me know that there's rot on the local and county level. Has any of that changed?
None of that has changed. We've called for an investigation into the police departments because, Ahmad is just the one that we know of with regards to something that has happened. We don't know what other stuff is going on there. But nothing that we're aware of has come to the forefront of an investigation that's going on with that policing unit, with that police department. And interestingly, on the 27th of this month, in 10 days or something like that, we're going to be back down in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, because there's an appeal that's been filed for the federal hate been convicted of. So we'll be back there for the federal hate trial conviction appeal.
Attorney Taylor, you see, it's not that you don't know, but it's everywhere. It's Baltimore. It's Chicago. It's Georgia. We can just keep, it's Louisiana. We can keep on going. What is it about policing in well, I'll just say in the United States, but you see this abuse of power everywhere all over the world. But let's stick here in the United States, where we see it racialized, where we see women when we're traveling or driving home late at night, you are a little nervous about getting pulled over by a male police officer, quite frankly, because you don't quite know where this can go. I mean, because people are so abusive of power, Attorney Taylor.
Well, I want to commend Attorney Jones for fighting that case and taking it to the prosecutors, because the prosecutors are the silent conspirators in all these cases. And I touched upon it before, but in the Jackie Wilson case, there was a string of prosecutors, starting with the prosecutor who was in the station house when he was tortured, and when his brother was tortured, and when his brother said, "I'm not going to give a confession until you stop torturing me." This prosecutor said, "Take the jag off out of here." And they took him back and tortured him some more. And it went all the way down through 3 trials where the prosecutors fabricated evidence, used jailhouse informants, false evidence, a litany of stuff. And this is why the county of Cook, for the state's attorney's office, ended up giving this settlement because of a 30-year pattern in Jackie's case, which is much more than just in the Jackie's case, but is in wrongful conviction cases in general, is so outrageous. And because Kim Fox is a progressive prosecutor here in Chicago, and Tony Preckwinkle is a progressive head of the county board, they finally decided to make right behind what the prosecutors had been doing for generations. But I think that's really, really important. And also the mention of the Brave Cave. In Chicago, it was called Holman Square, but in Baton Rouge, it's called the Brave Cave. And my office has just been invited in to work on that case because of our work on the Burge cases and on the Holman Square case. And the parallels you see again and again in this kind of activity is something that you got to call out. The communities at much risk organize around it, and it's only when that happens that you get any kind of positive response from the powers that be. Otherwise, it goes on in secret, and it goes on with people terrified by what can happen to them individually, and that's what I think we're all collectively trying to fight against.
Well, we keep hearing about the prosecutors, they're being in league and cahoots with the police. When we have prosecutors who really try to advocate for the people, well, first of all, you got to let me know what a prosecutor is supposed to do. Because when I look at a Kim Fox, when I look at a Marilyn Mosby, when I look at these progressive prosecutors, the gentleman in Philadelphia, they all get put out of office. They're shamed. They're blamed. The police hate them, make their lives, make their work lives virtually, professionally. They create so many hurdles. There are so many hurdles in place. They cannot get over them. And Marilyn Mosby, for example, was from a police family. She was not anti-police. She was anti-corruption. I mean, you talk to Reverend Dr. Yuri. I mean, we just lost Kim Fox. She said, "Look, I gave you my best shot. I'm out of here." And all these people are like, this is just, I mean, that's what I see. Reverend Dr. Yuri.
We had a press conference here at Douglas as the lead up to Marilyn Mosby's trial was progressing. Because at the time, and I don't think Kim Fox had yet determined that she was not going to run, but she had already been clearly targeted, if you will, as had Kim Gardner, as had Marilyn Mosby here, as our sister in Florida, because they were leaning against the trend of just kind of giving a rubber stamp to police departments doing whatever they wanted to, and then not having to follow through on their obligations as you get close to trial. As I'm sure Attorney Taylor and Attorney Darrell Jones will know, one of the first things we have to do when we are pushing back against what we know are suspect prosecutions for clients is we have to push for the discovery. Because a lot of times there will be a statement just kind of inserted somewhere to try to give a pass to the confirmation that is required to be able to make it evidentiary when we get to trial. A lot of that is done by the prosecutor. The prosecutor determines how and is responsible for getting things into evidence when we get to trial. But remember, the objective is not to go to trial. The objective is to create so much pressure that in order to get the thing to go away, you get a confession that leads to a plea. 97%, roughly, of criminal prosecutions in state courts across the country are resolved by plea. The vast majority of them, a handful of them relatively, go to trial. And unless you go to trial, there is no pressure on the prosecutor or the police to have to produce, consistent with the law and the rules, to show the evidence that they're using to decide whether or not the state's going to meet its burden to prove every element of every crime charge beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard. So what happens is you have judge, jury, executioner being contained inside of a process that's controlled by the two bedfellows, if you will, of the police department and the prosecutor, outside of the purview, the scope, the review of the courts, and more importantly, the people who are the ones who have to sit in the box, as we say, to be members of the jury. We cannot forget the name Abner Louima in New York, how he was actually brutalized and sodomized back in the late 90s. I mean,
In the station.
in the station, right? Imagine, right? And so you have to be suspect. Officer friendly ain't so friendly anymore. And when we consider the origins of policing, as I've mentioned before, you have to remain vigilant, and the people have to remain vigilant, because in this process, prosecutors, the elected state's attorney or district attorney, whatever the case may be, they're elected by the people. The judges, when they first get to the bench, are often appointed by the governors who are elected. They then have to be reelected in many states after some time by the people. That's why we have to make sure that part of our civic obligation is to make sure that the Flint Taylors, the Darrell Joneses of the world have the reinforcements from the people. We have to show up for jury duty. Even though we may not know what case we're going to be called to sit on, it can't just be, well, it's too inconvenient for me, or I'll take a pass. You never know when the case that's in the queue is the case that ultimately matters for the accountability to fall where it needs to fall. And so when we hear this, when we're reminded of this, these stories are shocking to us in real time, but their origins are past time. It's been part of the culture of policing going all the way back to the beginning. We cannot forget Freddie Gray in Baltimore. His torture was a rough ride on the way to the hospital that severed his spine, broke his neck. He died a week later. And his only crime was he didn't want to be bothered by the police that Sunday morning, and he took off running. Those are the prices that we pay, the repetition, if we turn away from and don't fully challenge the practices and the patterns and get the federal government involved where we can. But the people have a role in this too, especially when it comes down to jury verdicts around the civil actions. If you don't make these local governments pay and pay dearly for the cost of just upsetting lives and taking away someone's liberty, they're going to do it again and again because they use public funds to pay for these egregious acts, and it simply becomes another cost of doing business. We cannot allow that, and we have to strategize to push back against it.
Clearly, Attorney Taylor, you see this as a systemic problem. You called it the torture machine. Machine. I was struck by that. And you connected it to racism and police violence. And you said, no, I charge Jacques. I charge you, Chicago. There's something rotten in the system here. We see that it's everywhere. But have you ever been accused of playing the race card? Attorney Taylor. Oh, we can't hear him.
I've been accused of a lot of things. I'm not sure that I've been accused of that per se. I've certainly been, there certainly is a grave pushback when you raise the question of racism, whether it's in the courtroom or whether it's, in the public media, because people don't want to hear that. The powers that be want it to always be something else. They want it not, the fact that 125 black men were tortured by Burge over a 20-year period, somehow that's not racism. Somehow that's not systemic. But so in that sense, the reality trumps any kind of accusation for sure. And that's why the title of the book, The Torture Machine, has two meanings, right? It's the torture machine, the box. It's on the cover, but it's also the democratic machine, which ran that box through Burge. So it's that raises the systemic aspect of it. And then, of course, the subtitle, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago, speaks for itself as well. So yes, I guess the short answer to your question is it definitely is systemic, and it definitely is racist, and is a tool of white supremacy.
Well, I mean, you put the democratic machine in it. Of course, this is the most formidable political machine built by Richard Daley, and it is still, the architecture is still there today. Why did you bring the democratic machine into it?
Well, particularly back in the day when the torture was happening in the cover-up, it was happening under Richard M. Daley, Richie Daley, who was the state's attorney of Cook County in the 80s when he was the prosecutor, when his people were getting all of these confessions and sending people off very quickly to death row and to prison. And then Richie Daley became the mayor here from 1989 to 2011. So that was the machine. It was, his daddy's machine back in the 50s and 60s when they dealt with the Democratic Convention and when there was the uprising on the west side of Chicago and Daddy Daley said shoot to kill black people who were out on the streets protesting. So yeah, that's I think a short answer to why I said the democratic machine, because it was so powerful. It's not as powerful now. It has cracks in it, obviously, and we see progressive leaders with Kim Foxx and Preckwinkle, and hopefully Mayor Johnson, who certainly ran and got elected as a very progressive mayor. And but the jury's still kind of out, particularly on issues of police brutality and violence here in the city. And he hasn't really stepped forward, in my view, to the degree that he should have. And we're still hopeful that he will.
Well, I just as a former New Yorker, I saw what Bill De Blasio tried to do, and I saw the police turn on him. And the police, when you're the mayor, the police are like your Secret Service. You're the president; they're your Secret Service, and they oversee your family. And yours the protection of your home, the protection of your wife, your children, your partner, your husband, and it is it it's kind of ugly. I saw Bill De Blasio have to pump the brakes because he found himself in a vice. Not making excuses for people, but this is how deep the system is. I just want to give a minute to each of you. In the next hour, we will be talking about election 2024. There is underwhelming support for the Democrats, to put it rather mildly, in 2024. Should the White House, the Biden White House, be concerned? What can they do to turn things around? Uh, Attorney Jones, 1 minute for you.
Well, Santita, one of the resolutions and one of the things that our listeners can do with regards to what we're dealing with this over policing and the hypersexuality of what we're hearing about in policing and the things that are going on there. Every police chief in America is appointed. They're appointed by a mayor or a county executive or another person. It is so important that we pay attention to who we're voting for and the appointments that they make, because that's how we get to the point of being certain that those that we elect are being held accountable and our voices are being heard. The same is true with the judges, but for policing right now, we need to be certain that the chief of police, the sheriffs who are elected, are accountable to the communities and are putting in place policies that are consistent with the practices that we think will make a stronger community and a safer community.
Pardon me, everybody. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to give you 30 seconds, Reverend Dr. Yeary, and you 30 seconds, Attorney Taylor. Reverend Dr. Yeary.
Real quick, Mississippi is not the only place that's burning. If you remember the movie about the police killing of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, that fire has spread, and so we've got an out of control flame that we've got to extinguish. We can't just contain it, and so let's stay in it together and look at the document "We Charge Genocide," which Mrs. J, your mother, pointed out to me on a call a couple of days ago. It will tell us everything we need to know about the fight we're in right now.
Well, my mom is a fighter, just turned 80, God bless her, on St. Patrick's Day. Imagine that. The Afro one on St. Patrick's Day. I'm not mad at you, Mama.
That's St. Jacqueline's Day. Patrick came along late.
There you go. Attorney G. Flint Taylor, you get the closing thought. And everyone, I hope you get the book, The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. It is a stunning read. If you want to understand policing in America today, and if you want to understand what you can do to make a positive change, please get that book. Attorney Taylor.
Well, I want to claim, and we need to claim, people's victories. And when the community comes together and raises these issues and obtains some modicum of justice, whether it be in reparations or whether it be in bringing these torturers to some form of justice, we need to claim that, and we need to fight for that, and we need to all come together and form that fist with the community so that we can fight for those victories and raise these issues and claim them when we get them. They may be few and far between, but they're very important.
Oh, well, if the struggle will continue, and we will win. Victory is certain if you continue with the struggle. Let's talk about election 2024. Attorney G. Flint Taylor, thank you for being heroic, and I'm just grateful that I got a chance to know in my lifetime one of the true heroes of my life, you, Attorney G. Flint Taylor, and you too, Attorney Darrell Jones, and you too, Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary. Thank you all for fighting the best fight and getting into the best of trouble. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in just